Hello, welcome everybody to my book review. Today I'll be doing a report on Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. It falls under the top heading of dystopian fiction, which is a form of speculative fiction, and as such is set just very immediately in our future. In this story, reading is forbidden, and the government is in pretty absolute control of things. It's set somewhere in the U.S. All I know for certain is it's not Chicago. It tells the story of the protagonist, Guy Montag. And Montag is a fireman. In this dystopian future, there's houses are coated with something, and so they don't typically burn down by accident. And so they have these firemen, and the fireman's job is to burn houses down. So they're an extension of the law, and they burn houses down that contain books. So if you own books, they send these firemen in, they arrest you, and burn your house down. And he likes his job, as far as he knows. And he meets a young person, a young woman named Clarice. She's 17 years old, and she's pretty engaging. They're heading home the same way, and they have a number of conversations over a few days. And she asks him a question, and that question is, are you happy? And that's the inciting incident for the story. He comes to the realization that he's not happy. And that realization is one of the major conflicts in the story. And it's a person versus self conflict. And here's a quotation from the book that gives you some sense of that conflict. He was not happy. He was not happy. He said the words to himself. He recognized it as a true state of affairs. He wore his happiness like a mask, and the girl had run off across the lawn with the mask, and there was no way of going to knock on her door to ask for it back. So once he comes to the realization that he's not happy, is partly his understanding of his relationship with his wife, which is very distant. He didn't really think about it, but it was fairly distant. And one night his wife overdoses on the pills that she takes to help her sleep. And he comes to the realization that there's an emptiness in her, regardless of how happy she seems. Shortly thereafter, Montag's group of firemen are called to a house to burn the house down, and the lady in it won't leave. So they are thinking of considering burning the house down with her in it, but she saves them the trouble by burning the house down herself. They've thrown the kerosene onto the books. She just lights a match and burns the house with herself with it. And the reason being, she can't leave her books. And so Montag starts to think perhaps, his lack of happiness and books are connected in some way. That clearly this woman's happiness and books were connected, and maybe his own would be the same. Shortly thereafter, he starts thinking about his work, and he's not sure that he should continue to do it. So he receives a visit from his fire captain, Beatty, and Beatty, in a lengthy several-page discussion, talks about how their society came to be the way that it is, uneducated, but very controlled. And for Beatty, that's a good thing. Now, he's hoping to draw Montag back into the fold, but he is unsuccessful. In fact, fuels Montag's curiosity. So, the first section, the hearth and the salamander, the hearth being the fireplace and the salamander being a mythical creature that lives in fire, that's the title of the first section, and fire being knowledge. So should he keep that knowledge to himself, as in with a hearth, or should he immerse himself in it, like the salamander? Second section is called the sieve in the sand. So Montag starts to try and read books, and he doesn't really understand it. And he tries to take Mildred with him too, and he has her sit and read books with him, and she also can't understand. And that's why it's called the sieve in the sand. So the knowledge is the sand, and the sieve is Montag, his inability to grasp the knowledge he has gathered. And so he thinks about who could help him with this, and he comes up with the idea of having Faber, an old retired university professor that he remembers having spoken with briefly a year or so earlier. So he goes to see Faber and basically coerces him into joining him. And they come up with a plan. And that plan is that they will plant books, they will have books built, have books printed, plant them in firemen's houses, and then the whole system will eat itself. And to that end, Faber, who's a bit of a coward, wants to stay in his apartment, but gives a green bullet-like earpiece to Montag so he can guide him through the process. Given that Montag isn't well read, and he knows that he'll have trouble with Beatty. So before they can implement this plan, Montag goes home and sees his wife and her friends and how vacuous and empty their conversation is, and he loses his composure and reads a poem called Dover Beach to them. Now, reading, of course, containing books is illegal, and he has a book and he's reading to them from it, and it disturbs them. But also, it's a very appropriate poem because it talks about the emptiness of modern society. Now, after this, Montag ends up going back to work, and they get a call, and the call ends at their house, so right at Montag's house. So during the conversation, shortly after the conversation that Beatty had with Montag, Beatty had sent around this monstrous 8-legged robotic hound, which is part of their enforcement tools. It injects people with some kind of killing agent if they try to escape. It sends he has sent the hound around to Montag's house, and Montag didn't get the hint. And so, having read this Dover Beach, they get to his house, and he is ordered to burn his own house down, and finds out that in fact his own wife had called in the alarm. During this altercation, during this moment, Montag is ordered to turn the flamethrower on his own house, and he is heckled quite hard by Beatty, who slaps him and knocks that green bullet-like thing out of his ear, and says that he's going to trace it back to whoever has it. And to defend Faber and to some extent his own position, Montag turns the flamethrower towards Beatty, and Beatty heckles him relentlessly, and he ends up killing Beatty with the flamethrower. And part of this person-to-person conflict they have is a really interesting engagement where Beatty actually is the author of his own death by simply not shutting up when he should have. And in his heckling during this person versus person conflict, he says to Montag, "Give a man a few lines of verse and he thinks he's the lord of creation. You think you can walk on water with your books? Well, the world got on fine without them. Look where it got you, in slime up to your lip." So, in any case, he kills Beatty and takes off, and has to run for his life, being chased by this mechanical hound. He goes to Faber, and Faber recommends that he head towards the river, and he will find people on the other side of the tracks outside of the city. So he escapes down the river. The police, so that people don't think that they've actually lost control of the situation, by having an attack on a grainy footage, they attack a random pedestrian and say that he's Montag and that Montag has been killed. But Montag escapes. When he goes into the river, he comes out in a symbolic baptism, becomes a new person, having an epiphany. Once he gets across the river, he follows the railroad tracks to the outskirts of the town, where he meets a group of former scholars who have escaped the city and plan on someday, when society destroys itself, to repopulating it with a more educated populace. And what they will do is they'll take books that they've read, have themselves hypnotized, rewrite these books, and then start a new society based on empathy and intelligence. Shortly thereafter, the city is destroyed in a nuclear blast, and we assume that these scholars return to populate the cities, and there is a renewal of sorts. Okay, the setting. Okay, the setting is a large American city. All we know for sure again is it's not Chicago, since Clarice McClellan says she's from Chicago, or she used to live in Chicago, and Montag met his wife in Chicago. So no, it's not Chicago. It's a dystopian future where reading books is illegal, and anything that would cause people to actually stop and reflect is in fact illegal. You're not allowed to be a pedestrian. You're not allowed to drive slower than 100 miles an hour, and houses have no porches. So the government controls anything, right? And they want it because they want to keep people under control. And Beatty says, don't want a man unhappy politically, don't give him two sides of a question. Give him one. Better yet, give him none. And that is how they conduct themselves. Okay? In order to maintain the status quo means a relatively ignorant populace that's easily controlled. They have a fairly an education system that relies on very little actual learning. They copy stuff down, they watch TV 4 hours a day, they run around and do sports, but they don't actually learn anything. And so when they're done, the kids themselves just are exhausted and just mind numbed and just go wreck things and drive around trying to hit things and hit people. And Mildred, who's typical of this, when she's feeling down, she drives around and hits animals with her car. The adults spend most of their time actually just in their parlors. And the parlors are what we call our living room. And in these things are wall. They've had 1, 2, 3, or all of the walls converted into television screens. The whole walls. So in the case of Montag's, they have 3 walls that are all television screens, and they're just full with this tons of really bright, engaging stuff that is empty of any sort of real thought. Right. So I'll describe the parlor to you, and then the kinds of people it turns out. Because abruptly the room took off in a rocket flight into the clouds. It plunged into a lime green sea where blue fish ate red and yellow fish. A minute later, 3 white cartoon clowns chopped off each other's limbs to immense incoming tides of laughter. So as you can see, it's very bright and vibrant and engaging and violent even, but empty of any content. And the sort of people that it turns out are accurately described by Clarice as people don't talk about anything. They name a lot of cars or clothes or swimming pools and say, how swell, but they all say the same thing. Right? So it turns out people who aren't capable of critical thinking or even of having any sort of real engagement with things. And the government likes that. And to the average person, it's fairly utopian, except that there is a cost to it. And that cost is to their spirit, and they don't really even know it. They know that they're engaged all the time and things are really bright, but they don't actually have anything meaningful in their lives. And so Mildred overdoses on sleeping pills, I think part of as a way of filling that hole, and she's not alone. So we take her as typical. And the men who come to pump her stomach when she has this overdose say, we get cases like these 9 or 10 a night. We just got another call 10 blocks from here. Someone else just jumped off the cap of a pillbox. So people have this emptiness in their soul that can't be filled by just mere entertainment, right? Or talking about nothing, right? And that plays out in the relationships also. Montag describes his relationship with Mildred in terms of the parlor. He says, well, wasn't there a wall between him and Mildred when you came down to it? Literally not just one wall, but 3. Right? So between her always having it being in the parlor, when she's not in the parlor, she's got these like earbuds in her ears, and so he can never really effectively communicate with her. Now, that's by government design, right? Now, it wasn't always this way, and the government didn't make it this way. We made it this way. The government just decided that it was a good way to be, so that they can control the population and get them to do what they want. So Mrs. Phelps describes her relationship with her husband in terms of what the government wants from him and his relationship with her. She says, quick war. Pete was called yesterday. They said he'd be back next week. He said, if I get killed, get married again and don't think of me. We're independent. It's our 3rd marriage each. Right? So the relationships are really marriages of convenience, and when one doesn't work out, you just go off to another. And the government can also tell Pete, we're going off to war. We'll be back in a week. And he doesn't know enough to disagree, right? And this, so we don't get much of a sense of where things are, but we do get a sense of what it's like to live there, right? When Montag is fleeing from the police, he is almost hit by a vehicle driven by some teenagers who are trying to hit him intentionally, right? Because one of the things that this soulless society is absolutely lacks empathy, and so people get hurt each other all the time. And he says, for no reason at all in the world, they would have killed me, right? They would have hit him with the car, and the only reason they didn't is because he fell down, and they didn't want to like drive over him and wreck their car, right? And so this horrible life leads to exactly where you think it's going to lead. Leads to war and the complete destruction of society. So the whole time in the backdrop there's this war, and nobody's really aware of it, and that's to the government's advantage because they don't want people thinking they can get out of it. Anyway, but it ends up being the ruin of their society. And he's described as, the war began and ended in an instant. The sound of its death came after. It's very chilling, but the idea was that it was a very quick nuclear war, and Montag is outside the city, sees the nuclear blast, but doesn't hear it for some seconds later. But anyway, the world is completely destroyed. But there is some hope at the end, in the sense that these scholars are going to rebuild society. Okay, the characters. So the protagonist is Montag, and he does the most development as a character as far as the novel goes. He begins, thinks he's happy with his job, burning things as a fireman. He says it was a pleasure to burn. It was a special pleasure to see things blackened and changed, and he really thinks he likes that. As he walks home, we get a sense that he's not really a thinking guy. He's a doing guy, because he describes him as thinking little at all about nothing in particular. But he seems to be primed for change. These characters in these dystopian fictions, there's always one guy who figures out that the system is rigged against the average citizen, and he's that guy. And Clarice has figured him out, that he's not quite the fireman that everyone else is, and he's not quite as a conformist as everyone else. And she says, when I talk, you look at me. You're one of the few who put up with me. That's why I think it's so strange you're a fireman. It just doesn't seem right for you. And it turns out that it isn't. Right? And when the old woman kills herself, that's when the real change starts to happen. And it's described as, he could feel the poison working up his wrists and into his elbows and his shoulders. His hands were ravenous, and his eyes were beginning to feel hunger, as if they must look at something, anything, everything. Right? So he become this poison they talk about is curiosity. And all of a sudden he's ravenous to learn. And then, as he goes through this process, he goes into the river. When he comes out of the river, it's like a symbolic baptism. He's washed clean of all of the remnants of his old society, all of the artificiality of it. It says, the land rushed at him, a tidal wave. He was crushed by the darkness and the look of the country and the million odors on the wind that iced his body. Right? So all of a sudden, all of these real experiences hit him all at once, and it's quite overwhelming for him because he's not used to real experience. Now we'll look at Clarice, the young woman that he meets. She is a very clever girl, very engaging, and she serves as a foil to Montag in the sense that she's 17 years old, right? She's 13 years younger than Montag is, and yet she's so much more engaging and engaged and knowledgeable and thoughtful, and so she serves as a foil for Montag. So we see where he has to go. She could be described as a manic pixie dream girl, which is a trope where a character who doesn't really do anything other than act on the main character. It's usually a female character that is really engaging, who acts on the main character to get him out of his situation. You could argue that, which might weaken your consideration of the novel, but in any case, she's described as, her face was slender and milk white, and in it was a kind of gentle hunger that touched over everything with a tireless curiosity. Turned to him now, her face was fragile milk crystal with a soft and constant light in it. It was not the hysterical light of electricity, but the strangely comfortable light of a candle. Right, so she's this very thoughtful, engaged person. That's quite a change from from the other people he sees, but he also makes her quite different from the average person, right? He says, I'm antisocial, they say. I don't mix. I'm very social indeed. I don't think it's social to get a bunch of people together and not to let them talk, do you? Right? So she just doesn't fit in, though, right? Because they want to conform to society. His Mildred, who also serves as a foil to her husband in the sense that she never grows over the course of the novel. We watch him grow in comparison to her, right? And she is absolutely incapable of growth. So one of the best ways to show that is that she her relationship with her friends, but also when Montag tries to educate her, it absolutely doesn't work. And she says, Mildred kicked at a book. Books aren't people. You read, and I look all around, but there isn't anybody. Right? So he's describing people in the stuff that he's reading, and she has no imagination. Right? And that's what he's dealing with. Beatty is a very powerful figure. Captain Beatty is the fire captain, right? He's the one who's in charge of, going to these fires, burning people's houses down, and also keeping the other firemen in line. He's arrogant, confident, and self-assured in the sense that he thinks that the firemen are doing a good thing, right? So Captain Beatty sat down in the most comfortable chair with a peaceful look on his ruddy face. He took time to prepare and light his brass pipe and puff out a few clouds of smoke. So he comes to Montag, sits in his best chair, smokes his pipe with a certain air of arrogance to him. But he's confident. Part of it is confidence in what he's doing. He describes their job to Montag. The important thing for you to remember, Montag, is that we're the happiness boys, the Dixie duo, you and I and the others. We depend on you. I don't think you realize how important we are, to the happiness of this world as it stands. Right? So he's confident in the job that he's doing. Interestingly enough, though, later on in the novel, Montag comes to the realization that when he kills Beatty, that Beatty wanted to die. Beatty was heckling him there because he actually wanted him to die. He actually wanted himself to die because he's obviously well read. He quotes literature. He's very articulate. He's obviously read books, and I think Bradbury is saying you can't be happy being surrounded by ignorance when you know what he knows, and he can't share it with anyone. He has all this knowledge in his head. And he can't share it with anyone, and he's profoundly unhappy and dies as a result of it. Granger, the professor, is sort of a cowardly little man who saw the degradation of society and chose not to act. Right, and so Montag, he's again, Faber acts as a foil for Montag in the sense that he knows everything Montag wants to know, but isn't willing to do anything with his knowledge, which shows Montag to be a man of action, regardless of knowing everything he needs to know. He really wants to act in the world and make it a better place. So Faber says, come along. I would have actually let you walk right out of my house. I am a cowardly old fool. Right? And it takes Montag to get him stirred into action. And the final character I want to talk about is Granger. And Granger is the leader of these outcast scholars who live on the edges of the city. He's a very thoughtful person who intends to reintegrate society. But even when we had a book on hand a long time ago, we didn't use what we got out of them. We went right on insulting the dead. When people ask us what we're doing, we can say, we're remembering. So his plan is to repopulate the world with books and remember the good days of how it used to be. Okay, so in terms of the themes of the novel, they all hinge around one idea, and that idea is what would happen if the world gave up reading? If technology and mass communication had eliminated the necessity or the desire to read. And all of the other themes, which are borne out by the satirical nature of the novel, shows us how ridiculous we would become, both politically, personally, and socially, if we were to stop reading. Politically, we would lose our freedom, and we would simply have to go with whatever the government says, and that freedom is lost by simply our ignorance to what's really going on. So in this case, I want to start with how things got the way they were. Beatty says, there was no dictum, no declaration, no censorship to start with. No, technology, mass exploitation, and minority pressure carried the trick, thank God. Now we can be happy all the time. Right? So that the government didn't make things the way they are. People's lack of reading made things the way they are. The government just simply took people's freedom from them. and people didn't notice, right? And now that they've lost their freedom, they've they've simply unaware that it's gone, and they have to believe whatever they're told. So Montague has his book that tells him the origin of the fire department, of burning houses down. It says established in 1790 to burn English-influenced books in the colonies. First fireman Benjamin Franklin. Right, so that firemen have always burned houses down, which we know to be ridiculous, right? Because we live in the time before this, when firemen save houses. But he's in no position to disagree with that, because he doesn't know anything. So he's forced to believe that to be the true history, which is a lesson for us, right? In the sense that we would lose our freedom to know the world, and be forced to believe what we're told, which happens a lot. It's happening in the States right now. It happens in North Korea, all kinds of other places where people don't understand how the world works, right? And the society is missing something. And what is it missing? It's missing, as Faber points out, number one, quality of information. So you have to have good stuff to read, whether it's in a book or on a screen. You have to read stuff that has validity. Number two, leisure to digest it. So once you've read the stuff, you need time to actually assimilate that information. And third, the right to carry out actions based on what we learn from the interaction of the first two. So having quality information, time to digest that information, and the right to act on that information, and that's what the society needs. Now, society gave up the first thing, and then the other things were taken from them, and now they have no way of informing themselves. Okay? Now, so that's the political ramifications of not reading. There are also social ramifications for not reading, and personal ramifications for not reading. Right? When the social ramifications are, when we meet with people, we have nothing to talk about. Right? When Mildred meets with her friends, they just say, "Oh, you look swell. Doesn't everyone look nice? Nice. You look fine, Millie. Fine. Everyone looks swell. Swell." Montague stood watching them. Right? And so they have, nominal friendships where they get together and do stuff, but they don't have anything to talk about, and no real connection. And when Mildred's friends talk about their relationships, now we also miss out on things on a personal level. We miss out on relationships. So the relationship between Pete and his wife, Pete Phelps and his wife, between Montague and Mildred, but also between teenagers and their parents. One of the mothers, which is Mrs. Phelps, I plunk the children in school 9 days out of 10. I put up with them when they come home 3 days a month. It's not bad at all. You heave them into the parlor and turn the switch. It's like washing clothes. Stuff laundry in and slam the lid. Mrs. Bowles laughed. They'd just as soon kick me as kiss me. Thank God I can kick back. Right? So that just spending all of your time with entertainment and not reading or reflecting leads to inferior relationships. So the parents don't care about the kids. They just have the TV raise them. And then the kids themselves completely lack in any sort of empathetic qualities, right? They drive around wrecking things and killing people, right? And Granger realizes that, in fact, we never seem to learn these lessons. He says, "There was a silly damn bird called a phoenix back before Christ. Every few hundred years he built a pyre and burned himself up. He must have been first cousin to man, but every time he burned himself, he sprang out of the ashes. He got himself born all over again. And it looks like we're doing the same thing over and over. But we've got one damn thing the phoenix never had. We know the damn silly thing we just did." Right? So that we can, he's hopeful, although he sees us just simply burning ourselves over and over and over again, but hoping that one day we will learn. And so he's hoping that this is the case. Right? So the book ends on a hopeful note, but it tells us there's a cost to not reading, politically, socially, and personally. Right? And the final thing is it a good book? So this is we discuss the literary quality of the book. Okay, in some ways, one of my friends' criticisms of it, when I think is an accurate one, is it is kind of pedantic, in the sense that as we're reading the book, we get a sense of Ray Bradbury pointing his finger at us and going, "You kids, you read your books, or else this stuff will happen." So it has a bit of a pedantic tone to it. And when we see Beatty and Faber give long speeches, long discussions of the way the world used to be, they seem like it's really Ray Bradbury talking directly to us. But it has tons of really good literary quality, some really good analogies, good metaphors, similes, personifications, those kinds of things. I was just describing when Faber describes society. He says, "From the nursery to the college and back to the nursery, there's the intellectual pattern of the past 5 centuries or more." Right? So it's a really college to nursery, nursery to college is a good analogy for us. Right? Beatty's death provides us with a very really beautiful, I mean beautifully is not the right word, accurately described show of how awful it would be to be burned to death. There was a great hiss, like a great mouthful of spittle, banging a red-hot stove and bubbling and frothing as if salt had been poured onto a monstrous black snail to cause a terrible liquefaction and boiling over of yellow foam. So that's a description of Beatty's body being burned. So it's quite visceral in its descriptions. Right? It also has some good suspense to it. When Montag's being chased by the teenagers in the car, there's very short sentences. No short sentences really make it hum along. And the beetle is being described here as the beetle is like a car, a beetle-shaped car. Right? The beetle was rushing, the beetle was roaring, the beetle raised its speed, the beetle was whining, the beetle was in high thunder, the beetle came skimming, the beetle came in a single whistling trajectory fired from an invisible rifle. It was up to 120 miles per hour, it was up to 130 at least. Montag clamped his jaws, the heat of the racing headlights burnt his cheeks it seemed, and jittered his eyelids and flushed the sour sweat out all over his body. That's a very, very intense moment. So there's a good tension there. There's also a ton of really good allusions, and those allusions are references to things, to other works, to Greek mythology, to the writings of Samuel Johnson. There's all kinds of other references, and I think that's one of the things that makes this book really richer to read. And one of the things that books do for us, according to Faber, is books are to remind us what asses and fools we are. They are Caesar's praetorian guard, whispering as a parade roars down the avenue, "Remember, Caesar, thou art mortal." Right? So that's kind of an interesting thing. So it's just an allusion to using Roman history as a comparison with books. And there's a reference to something Samuel Johnson said, which I think is beautiful. "We cannot tell the precise moment when friendship is formed. As in filling a vessel drop by drop, there is at last a drop which makes it run over. So in a series of kindnesses, there is at last one which makes the heart run over." Which I think is a beautiful description of how friendships are formed. You know how you don't necessarily know that it's happening or see it happening, but just all of a sudden there it is. You've been hanging with this person, all of a sudden you're friends. Right? And then finally, in one of the most beautiful passages in the book, Faber describes what books do for us. He said, "There's nothing magical in them at all. The magic is only in what books say, how they stitch the patches of the universe together into one garment for us." Right? So how, reading books helps the world make sense in the way that putting a bunch of varied garments together and stitching them together into one thing that we can wear. Right? So it's a beautiful metaphor. It also gives us a real sense of what Bradbury wants for us, and that is read books, read quality literature, and when we engage with the world, engage with it in a personal way. So I really love the book, and I hope you do too. Thank you.